This time on the 28th of January. It's been a while since I last made a broadcast, so my apologies for the long absence. It's actually getting pretty difficult to find the time to fit these broadcasts into my working week. So I found myself a little bit of time this afternoon, so I thought I'd make a little video about two different subjects. The first subject I wanted to talk about is actually Belize, a former British colony in Central America. Now, for those of you who don't know where Belize is, it's on the northwestern tip of South America, as I recall, and was part of an array of Caribbean colonies and slaving outposts which were established by the British state. And over many hundreds of years, the people of Belize were largely enslaved to work in the mahogany forests, basically cutting and shipping mahogany logs from their own country and exporting them to the UK to be used there. Now, when I say slaves, I really do mean slaves. The slavery which Britain used in its colonies was widely reviled. It was one of the most brutal slaving nations on the planet at the time. However, Belize has now become an independent state. And interestingly, it is the only British protectorate of all of the former Caribbean colonies and other places that the UK had effectively colonised and enslaved to never have been visited by the King. In fact, King Charles has never been to Belize. And because of this, they, I think, took the decision that it was about time that now that they're independent, that they removed the King, or the Queen, as it was in the past, from their banknotes. Now, the image of the monarch was traditionally used in former British colonies, or what the British term with this euphemism, the Commonwealth, which is weird because there's nothing common about it, and there certainly wasn't any wealth other than that extracted by the British state over hundreds of years. However, the fact is that the Belize people decided to remove the King from the banknotes. So they've issued a whole series of new banknotes featuring prominent political figures and presidents who are regarded by the Belizeans themselves as their heroes, the people who liberated their country from British control. Now, Belize is a very tiny country in terms of its population, having something in the region of 400,000 inhabitants, so it's a very small place in terms of its population. But the fact that they've done this and taken this step of removing the British monarch as the head of state from their currency is a step in the decolonisation of the entire social fabric of the country, and it's part of a series of steps which the Belize government is planning over the next decades. Now, that includes things like renaming of streets and places and towns, and removing things like statuary and photographs or paintings of British monarchs or other colonists or people who exploited the country in one way or another. And this is, I think, an essential part of any country's final liberation, because when you are a colony, and we know this very well living in Scotland, we suffer from what's sometimes termed the colonialism of the mind. The colonial mindset is one where we are encouraged to believe that we're powerless, that we can't change anything, and that we basically, to coin a modern term, have to just suck it up and get over it, as many unionists keep telling me whenever I make broadcasts like this. And there is always this remaining British sarcasm about nations which have freed themselves from British rule. However, it's encouraging and inspiring to see such a small country taking such a vital step, and one of many thousands of small steps which this small nation will take to effectively remove all British influences, all British place names and street names, any sign of the former colonial masters being pretty much completely removed and replaced by real people from Belize who were crucial and were courageous enough to stand up to British rule and actually liberate the country. So it's an important step, and one of many, many thousands of smaller steps which will be taken over the next decades in Belize as it removes all traces of British from the Belizean society. I'm hoping Belizean is the correct. Apologise to anybody from Belize if I'm mispronouncing that, people from Belize. Now, also on today's programme, I wanted to talk a little bit about the economy. We're seeing and hearing an awful lot about Rachel Reeves, the current Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's having a great deal of trouble balancing the books, as she sees it. Now, she's taking the approach that the British economy is a bit like running a household, which of course it isn't, and believes that we can't spend beyond our income, which is nonsense because the British state has its own bank which can literally magic money out of the air and lend it to the United Kingdom. So the UK as a currency issuer is quite capable of creating its own money to use for whatever its government wants, and that is exactly how the British state has been run for decades. Basically, the Chancellor of the Exchequer contacts the Bank of England and says, this is how much money we need to run the country for the next year. It's a bit more than last time. Create the money, lend it to us, we'll pay back the interest over this year, and then next year we'll do the whole thing over again. And that is basically how the UK is run. And this has been pointed out time and time again by Professor Richard Murphy, who is a qualified accountant and has been shooting holes in Rachel Reeves' ridiculous pronouncements on the UK economy for ages, and not only Rachel Reeves, but virtually every other British Chancellor that there has ever been. Remember that this nonsense about having to be able to earn more than you spend is often used as a justification for saying that Scotland couldn't possibly be independent because it's got so much debt that it has to repay. Except this is debt which the English state has taken out from its own bank and is paying the interest on our behalf, allegedly. But if the GEARS figures, the so-called these are the figures which the British state uses to try to convince us that we are bankrupt and we owe so much money we couldn't be independent. These are the general expenditure and revenue figures for Scotland, which they base on their borrowing on allegedly our behalf. But looking at it rationally, they are claiming that about 8% of the entire UK population, that's us, the Scots, actually responsible for about 40% of the United Kingdom's debt load. Now that is plainly ridiculous. That is, blowing the whole thing 6 or 7 times out of proportion to what it really is. And in fact, if we did have a debt at all, it would be tiny and manageable, and we could just as easily manage it as the British state does by having our own central bank. It also shoots holes in the notion that in order for Scotland to flourish in the future as an independent state, it needs to constantly grow its economy. And this is a bit of a fallacy. This feeds into the narrative that in order for businesses to flourish, they have to make more profits, sell more stuff, use more resources, and so on and so on. And those profits are funneled not into the business and not generally into the pockets of those who work in it, but usually into the pockets of the shareholders who own that business. And these can be multinational corporations, they can be massive pension funds, international pension funds with billions or trillions of dollars worth of assets who are making more and more money from these corporations. So this money doesn't flow back into the country, it flows out of the country and into the banks of these investors. In order for Scotland to flourish as a country where it's so resource rich, it needs to take advantage of the fact that it has all these natural resources. And instead of allowing private companies and big multinational corporations to extract the wealth from selling these resources to other people, we need really to take control of them. And that is what's known obviously as nationalisation, where the nation owns its resources and it decides how much it should pay for those resources itself. So in other words, if we are buying electricity and it's from our own generator, we can pretty much guarantee that we're going to get that electricity at the cost of production. There wouldn't need to be a profit margin on it. If there is, it will be small and then reinvested back into the business. Now that means that the benefit of the low energy costs are passed on to Scottish homes, Scottish businesses, Scottish shopkeepers, even Scottish transport networks like ScotRail and the bus services, which also, incidentally, should be nationalised. We already have a nationalised train service called ScotRail, which runs much more efficiently than that south of the border. We also have a semi-nationalised water industry. Now, this is a bit of a grey area, but the water industry is vital to Scotland's future economy because we hold something like 90% of the top quality drinking water for the whole UK. And 90% of it is obviously not going to be used in Scotland because we don't need all of that water, and we should be selling it to our neighbours down south at, you know, whatever price we want to agree with them. But we can't do any of these things if we don't actually own that resource and recognise that by forming companies or corporations which are nationally owned by ourselves as shareholders in the first place. Now, this is something we used to have when I was growing up. There was a gas board, a coal board. There would have been, although the petroleum industry wasn't nationalised at the time, it should have been, but electricity and gas, for example, were produced domestically by nationalised industries, which basically sold it to us at a much lower price. Any excess that we have, and remember, we're going to be generating a massive amount of surplus energy, oil, gas, and water. All of these commodities are vital to everybody else. There's no reason why they couldn't be sold abroad at market price, and that refinances the nationalised industries, pumps them full of money. They can then become more efficient. They can increase their production for export if necessary. But the nice thing about this is it allows the economy to stabilise rather than having to keep. It simply holds its own stock, basically. The entire country and all of its resources are owned by the people who live here. And this kind of nationalisation, if it's done professionally, could make Scotland into a huge powerhouse. And it's been possible to do this all along. In fact, an independent Scotland with all of its energy resources publicly owned could become the major engine room for most of Western Europe, which badly needs that energy, just the same way as everybody else does, especially England, including, I guess, Ireland, Wales, Northern Ireland, France, and basically everybody else nearby that we can reach with interconnectors. So all of this is possible, and it's not necessary to grow the economy much bigger than it already is, because eventually, if we do own these resources and we can sell our resources abroad, the ones that we don't need, it will be possible to enlarge these existing companies to increase employment, but without having to use up more resources to do it. The resources that we have, although not infinite, are pretty large, and as long as we manage them correctly, we could have a comfortable life for the next few hundred years. And there's no reason why that shouldn't happen. So all of this is possible. I heard somebody suggest on the, I think it was on Blue Sky today, that when Scotland does become independent, Professor Richard Murphy should become the Chancellor of our Exchequer, because he has a much better grip on the dynamics of national economics than most politicians that we've ever seen in the job of Chancellor of the Exchequer. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there today, but I think it's encouraging that a country which has a tenth of the population of Scotland has stuck two fingers up at King Charles and said, we're not putting your mug on our banknotes anymore. That is a nice thing to know. And the fact that we know that we can do so much better with our resources than the rest of the UK can, as it squanders them uselessly and pumps money into the pockets of shareholders and foreign investors, we know that we can channel that money into the country and not out of it, if only we had the levers of power. And that is where independence is the only actual option that we have for doing that. Anyway, let me leave you with those thoughts today. We have the power that we need, but we need to concentrate that power in the hands of the people. And we, the community of the realm, we are the Scottish Crown. And because we are, or we make up the Scottish Crown under Scots law, all of these resources are actually already owned by us, but they're being plundered. And that plunder has to stop, and the only way it can stop is, just like in Belize, by getting rid of the British influence permanently and becoming fully independent and taking back control of everything which already belongs to us. That's it from Inde-Car today. I'll see you all later in the week. Thanks for watching. And if you can, please keep donating to the programme. At the moment, I'm kind of scraping along the bottom in terms of donations. So if you feel like making a donation, and please only if you can afford it, I will always use them for making new programmes. I'll see you soon. Keep the faith. Bye for now.